lovely to. Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our Voices That Matter report launch. We're really pleased that you could join us this afternoon. And you'll be with us for the next hour and a half, and you're going to be very pleased to hear what Sarah has to present. Sometimes you'll be surprised, sometimes you'll be shocked, and most of all, you'll be very well informed about the experiences of women that we don't hear a lot about, Canadian Muslim women that we don't hear a lot about, and you'll hear their voices as Sarah will share with you. So welcome again to our Voices That Matter report launch. I'm going to begin with the Fatiha, or the opening. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayra al-maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship. It is you we ask help from. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not those who are the objects of anger, nor those who go astray. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to share with you that the land that I'm speaking to you from is the traditional territories of the peoples of Turtle Island. The sacred land on which I'm speaking from has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, or Takaronto, is still the home of many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. As Muslim women, we recognize the connection between anti-Indigenous racism and Islamophobia, and we're committed to working toward injustice for Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Nushat Jaffrey. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about why we did the study. What is the study all about? So the Voices That Matter is a report based on the work by Dr. Shah. We commissioned this work as part of our Strengthening Capacity project, where we wanted to strengthen the capacity of our knowledge about the realities of Canadian Muslim women that are often excluded from the work that we've done previously. We were very conscious of the fact that there were Canadian Muslim women that we were not able to reach. You know, we had a gap in our knowledge. And it was very, very important for us to close that gap and gather their voices, the information to learn more about Canadian Muslim women that we seldom included or heard from. So this is our attempt to understand, to learn, and then, you know, inshallah, be able to address their needs and the issues that they face in a more concerted way. Just before we begin the presentation with Sarah Shah, a few things that I'd like to remind you about is that today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards on our website at ccmw.com. If you are, if you don't want to be included in the Q&A session when we do show if you want to turn off your camera, you can. But of course, we will hear you from your mic. If you want to rename yourself so that you cannot be identified, please feel free to do so, because this will become publicly available. Please also ensure your video camera and microphone are muted during the workshop. You can turn on the camera so that we can see who all is here, but it's entirely up to you. But if you turn both off, this will eliminate any ambient noise and increase clarity for everyone. We also invite your comments and questions, and we'll run a live Q&A session at the end of the event. If you think of a question at any time, please type it into the chat, and we will be monitoring that throughout, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions after Sarah presents. So please do contribute to the session with an open mind and heart, and use I statements because it'll be coming from you. And consider the Q&A session as a dialogue, not a debate. So it would be really nice to be respectful of all viewpoints and listen with empathy and care. And let's listen actively to what we are hearing. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our researcher, Dr. Shah, who has a PhD and is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And she's also a research fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. And with us, she's a research consultant, as well as a research consultant to other Canadian Muslim organizations. Sarah is a lead researcher at the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative, or MICT, at the Institute of Islamic Studies. And their research focuses on the intersections of religion, family, and gender relations, racialization and immigration, and mental health. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuzad, for that warm welcome. I'm just going to share my screen so that you all can follow along with my slides. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very excited to share the highlights of this report with you. Given how extensive the report is and how nuanced the findings are, I can't cover everything. So please be sure to check out the report, which will be released today. Before I begin, thank you, Nuzad, for doing the land acknowledgement. So Nuzad and I are actually geographically close together because I was going to acknowledge the same land that she acknowledged. I would like to actually just hold space and recognize that I myself, as a settler who studies family well-being in relation to religion, as an alumni and a current employee of the University of Toronto, I feel the imperative to hold space and acknowledge the intergenerational harm that's been done to First Nations families, especially Indigenous women, especially Indigenous mothers and children, by the government, by religious institutions, and by the education systems. Featured on the slide is an image of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was acknowledged by Nuzad. Thank you for doing that. So I'll get into today's agenda. Today, I will share with you highlights from the reports, including a description of the study, as well as findings from the analyses and recommendations emerging from those findings. But first, I'd like to start with the historical and social context of the study. In terms of the study's context, I will focus on three main trends: the trend in CCMW's work, the trend in academic research more broadly, and trends in feminist activism. So starting with trends in CCMW's work, CCMW has a rich history of centering Muslim women when providing empirical evidence for professionals and the public. This includes secondary data analyses, but much of CCMW's research has involved primary data to create demographic profiles of Muslim women across Canada, as well as a series of studies to assess their needs from political participation, economic integration, and social experiences. These include Canadian Muslims' discriminatory experiences and everyday lived experiences as well. Collectively, this body of research provides important insight and a gendered perspective on Canadian Muslim women. The research also marks an important area in the broader trend in research on Canadian Muslims. So taking a step back and just considering the wide body of research on Canadian Muslim immigration and integration within and outside of academia, we can see a narrowing trend. Earlier research compares Canadian Muslims to non-Muslims to highlight the role of Islamophobia, racism, anti-immigrant discrimination, various forms of xenophobia, and the general climate of that Canadian Muslims are confronted by. After establishing the Canadian Muslim and non-Muslim comparisons, researchers turned to exploring gender disparities within Canadian Muslims and differences between Canadian Muslims and non-Muslim women. More recently, researchers are turning to intersectionality to center the experiences of specific groups of women to better understand their unique lived experiences and lived realities. Though I stress that this body of research is predominantly qualitative, there isn't much quantitative research in that field yet, hence why this study is important. This trend towards intersectionality also reflects trends in feminism and feminist action. I will say that there are many approaches to feminism and different ways of seeing those approaches as well. What I'm presenting here is my perspective and my understanding of the different approaches. Liberal feminism focuses on gradual institutional change to improve women's status collectively. So a woman's personal choice is not so much about her, it's about how her choice will impact gender equality beyond her at the institutional level. In this way, the category of women is often collapsed into a flattened, it's just gender, basically. And so because of power inequalities by race, by immigration, by ethnicity, geography, religion, and so on, the category of women, when it's collapsed, it really ends up reflecting the most powerful group of women in a given social context. In the Canadian context, it would be middle to upper middle class, white women of Christian backgrounds. Intersectional feminism focuses on women's own experiences and their lived realities, which empowers women to make their own choices. In this way, the category of women is unpacked to acknowledge that women's intersecting social identities impact their experience of gender, and acknowledging that gender is racialized, it is classed, it is amorphous, and it's shaped by the social location of every single woman. The actions that emerge from these two different approaches would also be different. So even though both approaches are championing women's advancement, they do so differently. Here I provide two examples. When thinking about whether a woman should work for pay or work at home, so be a homemaker, for example, liberal feminists would argue that it is every woman's responsibility to pursue paid work, to climb the corporate ladder, to break the glass ceiling, to lean in. Women who choose to be homemakers are seen as betraying the feminist cause. This differs from intersectional feminists. For an intersectional feminist, a woman may choose to be a homemaker without critique. Instead, there's understanding about the woman's own social location and lived reality. Maybe the woman may choose to be a homemaker because she very highly values feminized labor. It may also be that women are making constrained choices. So for example, women that I spoke to for a different study mentioned that they decided to stay home with the kids because they were so tired of experiencing racism on the regular at work. That's not something that would be on the radar for a liberal feminist necessarily, who's preoccupied with the focus on getting women into work. Now, intersectionality is pretty much the most important thing to happen to gender studies in the recent past. Intersectionality has really changed the way that we understand gender from a flattened, very white, very middle to upper middle class phenomena to understanding that gender and other social systems are inextricably linked. So in the example of the women who choose to be homemakers to avoid racism at work, you can't separate their racial identity from their womanness. They are racialized women. I'm going to quote Corinne Mason, who in her 2019 article, Buzzwords and Fuzzwords, stated that to be feminist in this moment, one must be practicing intersectionality. Okay, so I hope these examples have helped to clarify what the two approaches are. This study is rooted in an intersectional feminist approach. So let's talk more about the study. Here, I'll focus specifically on the guiding research questions before turning to the methodology. Based on both past CCMW studies and the current state of research, these guiding questions for this study focus on Canadian Muslim women's outcomes related to sociodemographics, socioeconomics, and health. I honed in on barriers and facilitators to certain outcomes, while also allowing space for women to engage in the questions the way that they wanted to, centering their own, what they thought was important, what was relevant for their lives. And I assessed the experiences for each group of Muslim women separately, and also in relation to each other. In terms of the methodology, this was a mixed methods design, and so there were both quantitative and qualitative methods that were utilized. For labor market participation and other socioeconomic and demographic outcomes, the focus was on prevalence, patterns, and disparities when it came to the quantitative analyses, and the meaning-making processes when it came to the qualitative analyses. I leveraged existing population-based data, namely the 2011 National Household Survey, for the quantitative analyses, as the 2021 Canadian Census data has not yet been released. I wanted to draw on additional data sets as well. The sample sizes were just too small to allow for meaningful conclusions from those data sets. For the qualitative data, I collected original data through surveys, interviews, and focus groups for these analyses. And just a note in this presentation, when I refer to participant names, those are pseudonyms. Those are not the participants' actual names for the sake of confidentiality and privacy. The quantitative and qualitative analyses are different, but also complementary, and they help us triangulate data to get a better sense of the lived realities of women. So let's turn to those results. When considering the quantitative and qualitative findings, I note that there's a bit of a difference. The surprising thing about the quantitative findings was that they're not surprising. Whoever I shared the findings with was sort of like, yeah, I expected that. An overview of the Canadian Muslim women's socio-demographic and socioeconomic outcomes show that they have poorer outcomes compared to non-Muslim women, and that specific groups of Muslim women experience poorer outcomes compared to the overall sample of Canadian Muslim women. And so the qualitative findings did surprise me. So here I'll privilege discussion around the qualitative findings over the quantitative findings. However, I note that the report includes both sets of analyses and a lot more nuance than what I'm about to show, even for the qualitative findings. So do definitely check out the reports to get deeper into the analysis. So let's start with first looking at the experiences and the needs among newcomer Canadian Muslim women. Newcomer Canadian Muslim women experience discrimination in multiple social and public settings, including when crossing the border. So for example, one woman was denied access when crossing the border as a visitor, even though she has American citizenship. When using public transit, for example, multiple women reported transit workers themselves denied service to these women, some of whom were pregnant or mothers with children and strollers. When seeking work on the job, so for example, one woman shared about how she tried to submit her resume and job application to a small shop that had like one of those help wanted signs. And when she came back to the store to get something, in that short time span of just a moment, when she came back, she saw that they had already thrown away her application in the trash. They also experience discrimination in stores and in other public spaces, especially women who don't speak English or French. So women who speak languages other than official Canadian languages. They reported feeling like other Canadians saw them as alien and that they had this perpetual feeling of being excluded. Much of these experiences were due to social exclusion and not a lack of social capital. So women were aware of the services and they knew that they should be able to access the services, but they were denied access by social service providers themselves. Mothers especially were the targets for this kind of discrimination. These experiences are exacerbated by barriers around language for those who do not speak official languages. But even for those that were able to speak English and French, they also experienced discrimination. Failure to provide adequate services was notably a consistent theme in the narratives that were provided by women who spoke languages other than English and French, and especially if they were mothers. So for example, Mariam, who is a newcomer from Afghanistan, she speaks Pashto. She reported that when I gave birth to my daughter, I asked the nurse to give me my daughter so I could give her milk. I was paralyzed from my stomach down and I said, give me my daughter. My English wasn't that good, so I didn't say please, although my intonation was far from demanding. She became very aggressive with me and she said, don't you know how to say please? She gave me my daughter, and when I asked for formula, she said, breastfeed her, and left. I could barely move, let alone breastfeed her, and I started crying. I was all alone and I spent the night crying. At that moment, I felt mistreated and I didn't know English well. I couldn't defend myself or speak up. This is an upsetting account, and what's especially upsetting is the finding that this issue is systemic. It was a repeated narrative across different interviews. Women who are newcomers are routinely denied basic services, especially if they are mothers and especially if they don't speak English or French. In terms of additional experiences, such as around the job market and on the job, again, I found similar patterns where newcomer women experience discrimination, especially if they are mothers and especially if they don't speak an official language. None of the women who speak a language other than English or French are, at the time of data collection, were currently working for pay. In fact, the only newcomer who reported a somewhat seamless integration into the labor market was another sociologist. And her case actually goes to show how nearly impossible it is for new immigrants to Canada to navigate the Canadian job market systems here. As a sociologist, she is an expert on society. You shouldn't need to be an expert on society in order to integrate. Okay, now let's turn to the experiences of Canadian Muslim single mothers. When we look at the findings for Canadian Muslim single mothers, who I will call single moms for short, here we see why it's so important to include both quantitative and qualitative data. According to the quantitative data, the socioeconomic outcomes aren't too different from the overall population of Canadian Muslim women, so it almost seems that single moms are doing really quite well. And the single mothers I spoke with echoed this sentiment, some participants repeating that single moms are the most resilient people that they know, that they can get anything done. And this likely reflects a selection factor. Only the women who have social, human, and economic capital, so for example, a network of friends, job skills, and money, so all those forms of capital combined with a developed sense of mastery and environmental control, so they have a strong sense of being able to get things done. Women with those kinds of personal, social, and economic resources can take the risk to live as single mothers in contexts where the odds are stacked against them. For example, one of the participants in the study managed to start a now very lucrative business. She wrote and published, and she sole parented during the initial COVID lockdown. And so it may appear that the women are able to navigate their lives with relative ease. However, Canadian Muslim single mothers experience unique challenges that are not captured in the quantitative data. Through qualitative focus group discussions, we better understand the hurdles, the barriers of their day-to-day life. And 3 specific hurdles include being stretched way too thin and having to find creative ways to spread their resources, being in marital limbo as religious leaders routinely deny access to religious-based divorce, and social isolation, especially during the COVID lockdowns. These factors also intersect for many women. So for example, Amreen said, I have no family here. Typical immigrant story, you get married, you're shipped to a foreign land, and you're told to build a life, but you're not given the tools, you learn as you go. When you take the life of living the life yourself, so living as a single mother with kids, trying to sustain a job, and I work for a nonprofit, so money is tight. The constant fear of being let go or we can't accommodate you and your kids, it is a constant fear that I live with because it's something that organizations do. Single mothers also reported the negative impact of the demands of work and family life, especially in the context of living under COVID-related restrictions. So for example, while all participants reported feeling some degrees of social isolation due to the COVID-related restrictions, single mothers had it especially bad, as people who they would regularly socialize with avoided them due to their children. They were actually told that these individuals were afraid of getting COVID from the kids. So single moms in this study were best able to articulate the gaps in the programs and policies and how they had to organize themselves in order to create resources to meet their collective needs. Single moms felt let down by both the Canadian social service sector and systems, as well as by Muslim communities who they felt privileged men and blamed women, even when the ex-husband's faults were made public knowledge. An especially frustrating and repeated narrative across interviews was how women's experiences around the difficulty of obtaining an Islamic-based divorce. Okay, let's turn now to the experiences of Black Canadian Muslim women. When they were asked about the most pressing challenges that they are experiencing, the Black women in the focus groups commented on the stereotypes that confront them, assumptions that others make about them, and the expectations that they are held to. In other words, Black Canadian Muslim women felt the weight of ideologies that are attached to their marginalized identities. Experiences of discrimination on the job market and in workplaces were identified as serious concerns for material and mental well-being. These concerns were exacerbated by their families' expectations and household demands, which were again nuanced by things like birth order. So for example, Black Canadian Muslim women are expected to earn and help financially provide for their home, especially if they are the eldest daughters, while simultaneously they are made to feel that it's selfish to invest in their own education. So this is a bit of a catch-22 that they're confronted with. Participants directly link these contradictory expectations to their mental health concerns. So here Fatima says, barriers to my mental health would be expectations, responsibilities, things that are seen as my duties can create guilt. For a long time, I was always trying to see what I was doing wrong. I thought it was my fault. I didn't realize there were external factors affecting me. There are certain family and work expectations and responsibilities that weigh me down. Across social and public institutions, Black Canadian Muslim women experience inadequate services and resources as they are confronted by the systemic and everyday racism in the public sphere and gendered expectations in the private sphere. They are held to this impossible expectation of financially providing for the family while also being expected to sacrifice their education to care for the family. And so while other Canadian Muslim women in the study, they pointed to assumptions that others, like those outside their homes, would make about them, Canadian Muslim women who are also Black report being sandwiched between those assumptions that others make and also expectations even within their families and their households. So now let's turn to the experiences of queer Canadian Muslim women. Unlike other participants discussed earlier, those who identify as queer Canadian Muslim women have a separate set of concerns. So those who were discussed earlier, they seem secure in their ethnic and religious identities, even if they did express some anxieties about their children's retention of those identities. But for queer identified participants, they were anxious about retaining their cultural and religious identities, but seemed less anxious about integrating into Canada. So for example, other groups of women fixated on breaking the Canadian job market, and they framed it as a major concern for them. But queer identified participants who also described the long and difficult process through which they had to go to secure jobs, they frame it as matter-of-factly, as if the difficulty in job hunting is a given and not a major concern. But what was a major concern was their integration into their own ethnic communities in the Canadian context, their ability to access communal and social supports from their communities of religious origin, so Muslims. It's noteworthy that all three queer identified participants in this study, they hold jobs that they're satisfied with, even if they're experiencing varying levels of precarious employment and even underemployment. Although other groups like single mothers report being scrutinized by Canadian Muslim communities as well, queer identified participants felt particularly unwelcome and also the subject to violence. And they feel othered by both mainstream Muslim and queer communities, limiting their access to support and resources. For example, Lena highlighted how she should probably seek therapy, but she cannot due to the nature of her paid work. She notes, "I don't have a safe space anywhere I go. I can't come out to Muslims, not that they be violent, but I can't be myself with them. I can see people removing themselves from my life. My friend, she's doing her PhD, and she tells me that I need to turn to God. I am with God. I fast, I pray. I'm a pretty spiritual person as it is. I do my own volunteer work for refugees. I do free translation work. What more? Not that I want credit for it, but what do you mean turn to God? How am I not being a decent person? And then within my own family, I can't be outspoken about my sexuality, but as long as it's not out loud, it's okay. Don't bring shame to the family name or whatever." The consistent theme across narratives of queer identified women demonstrates repeated experiences of social exclusion due to their gender, their sexuality, and even their religious identities. Unlike other women I spoke to who feel excluded from Canadian social and public spaces, queer identified participants were more similar to single mothers who reported experiences of scrutiny, surveillance, and exclusion from Canadian Muslim communities. But unlike single mothers in this sample, the queer identified participants express anxiety about also retaining their religious and ethnic identities. Let's turn now to women with diverse abilities. While other women that I spoke with felt easily accepted by societies and communities in their countries of origin or their parents' countries of origin, participants with diverse abilities were more similar to queer Muslims in this sense. They did not feel readily accepted. So for example, in Sumaya's narrative, when she returns to her parents' birth country, she feels like an outsider for not being able to eat the same foods as her relatives. One of the aspects of her specific need related to her diverse ability is having a specific diet. So in lieu of shifting practices and norms to be more inclusive of women with diverse abilities and needs, these women actually settle on just being content if their boundaries were respected. For example, that others should not make insensitive comments about their needs and accommodations. And the sentiment around just wanting healthy boundaries as like the bare minimum of not having to explain or defend one's life choices to others, especially family and extended family, was a repeated theme by also queer women and single mothers. However, for women with diverse abilities, the boundary was around having their own personal needs and like the related, so having their own personal needs that are related to their diverse abilities. And it wasn't about like their household structure in the case of single mothers or their choice in partners as it was for queer Muslims. It was framed around being badgered by others, especially from their families or their ethnic communities. And that made it clear that the closer that the person was to the person, the closer the person making these comments was to the women, the more insidious these comments were. So in other words, the closer the person was to the women, the deeper the comments cut. And it's not that, for example, with family members, that these people are making these comments to try to hurt the woman. They may genuinely and naively just not understand the realities that these women face with their diverse abilities and their diverse needs. So continuing with Sumaya's narrative, who I mentioned on the previous slide, given her dietary restrictions, she says, "My mom was really scared. She never had a kid staying at the hospital for like 10 days, but emotionally, nothing was touched on. If I felt overwhelmed, oh, just read more Quran. You know, the basic thing that immigrant parents talk about. And at that point, I wasn't as aware of mental health, but I think that's why I studied in a social and health related fields. I don't want future generations of immigrant kids to go through what I went through. The woman I spoke to described their diverse abilities and needs as no longer impacting their lives, and yet they both have shaped their lives in response to those needs, simultaneous to being Canadian Muslim women. Both frame their narratives as overcoming the disparities that they experienced related to the lack of social inclusion and accommodation of their diverse abilities and needs. This implies that their experiences would be different from other Canadian Muslim women with diverse abilities who, for example, those diverse needs continue to be unmet. And therefore, for example, they are unable to participate in research like the current study. I note that there were a number of women who were interested in participating in the study, but they actually ended up not participating given certain needs that they had related to their diverse abilities precluded them from being able to participate. We repeatedly rescheduled interviews, but eventually they ended up dropping out of the study. So there remains a gap in our knowing of how diverse abilities and related needs impact Canadian Muslim women. Nonetheless, the participants in the study shared how their lived experiences impact their social realities, and they highlighted how their experiences shape and are shaped by their identity and ability. So, for example, returning to Samaya's narrative, whose diverse needs impact her dietary considerations, this intersects with her Muslimness with options for halal food in Canada. And so Samaya was faced with situations where there would be no food options for her because the halal food wouldn't be appropriate for her dietary needs, given her diverse abilities. And the foods that would comply with her dietary restrictions were not halal. Okay, so let's turn now to the recommendations. The recommendations emerging from this report are presented thematically and based on commonalities across groups of women. However, I note that the specific recommendations for the groups are present in the report, so definitely check that out. In terms of recommendations, there were 6 main areas, namely navigating the job market, religious resources and support, support for community organizers, social isolation and social inclusion, culturally relevant and appropriate services, and policymaking. In terms of navigating the job market, it should be no surprise that the Canadian system, which deflates immigrant credentials and generally has an anti-immigrant bias, is difficult for especially for newcomers to crack. Shahina said, Canada is really open to accepting immigrants, but what are they doing for the immigrants? Let's be real. They're struggling with jobs. The reason my dad didn't come to Canada with the rest of the family was because he couldn't find the same level of work here. He eventually did, but only because one of his friends networked with him. Not many people have friends in Canada. They come here and they start from scratch. Canada invites immigrants, but then doesn't have services for immigrants. So I note that even women raised and educated in Canada also experience discrimination. For example, one woman who wears hijab, but she removed her niqab in order to be more accessible to her clients, she's experienced repeated discrimination during the interview process of getting hired. She shared that in her most recent job interview at the time of my interview with her, the interviewers repeatedly asked her about her stance on homosexuality. And even though she clearly and repeatedly stated that she would, of course, serve queer clients as well, the interviewers seemed skeptical, and not surprisingly, she didn't get that job. I note earlier that the only woman that I spoke with that seemed to be able to seamlessly integrate was another sociologist, so an expert on society. and she had done extensive research to analyze and understand the Canadian job market before coming to Canada. She actually secured a job and then moved to Canada. The women who seemed to be able to find work with a bit more ease than others were those who were able to use their identities as racialized Muslim women to secure work. In other words, they were able to capitalize on their otherness because of the racism that's endemic in the Canadian social fabric. Recommendations emerging from these findings include a critical assessment of racism in the hiring practices, including microaggressions. Assumptions that employers make about Canadian Muslim women, such as assuming that they must be homophobic, these assumptions act as barriers to their employments. Next is social isolation and social inclusion. Social isolation and inclusion emerged as serious concerns for multiple groups of women, but especially for newcomers and for single mothers. In the focus group of Black Canadian Muslim women, Aisha compared her experiences to Fatima, who was mentioned earlier. Both are Black, but Aisha is a newcomer and Fatima is not. She shared that, for me, I would say it's the same as Fatima, except that we moved here about a year ago and then the lockdown happened. Like, just as we were starting to familiarize with the country and culture and the people, even though I've been here for a year, I feel like, I know I'm still a newcomer, but I feel like if the lockdown didn't happen, I'd be much more comfortable, much more easygoing with everything. I feel like I wasn't able to meet people, especially whether they're from my cultural background or Muslims just generally. There was no interaction. Going to the mosque was not exactly an option. So it's like the ice, the feeling of coming to a new place, and you're prepared that you have to put in a lot of effort and a lot of work to blend in and to get to know people, to make connections. And that was just taken away. The opportunity was just taken away. I mean, it's no one's fault. So I think that doubles down on the isolation. I try to keep busy. I just keep myself busy, but there are times that it gets really hard. Newcomers who don't speak English or French, as well as single mothers, especially expressed feeling isolated. And newcomers who don't speak English or French, again, felt especially excluded from Canadian public social life. For example, some women who speak Pashto reported that others of their ethnic communities would speak English instead, further alienating these women. In my own experience, I found that newcomers from Pakistan who I speak to and who know I speak Urdu will still choose to speak to me in English. And I had assumed that it was because they wanted to practice their English skills. But now, in light of the current findings, I'm wondering if perhaps these newcomers who insist on speaking official Canadian languages might somehow be enacting an internalized form of racism. Anyway, recommendations emerging from these findings include creating social support groups, like one where single mothers could share their experiences without fear of judgment or scrutiny, and with a group of women who understand their experiences with empathy and understanding. This would differ from other social support groups for other groups of women. So for example, newcomers, social support groups should include people who are not newcomers so that the women can expand their networks and meet new people. Additionally, Canadian community and feminist organizations can address concerns about stereotypes that are related to Canadian Muslim women through education programs to demystify Islam and Muslims to the Canadian public, training on how to be better allies to Canadian Muslim and other minority women, and educating Canadians on how to identify and safely respond to racist discrimination and violence. In terms of religious resources and supports, it is clear that dominant culture in mainstream masjids is not serving women nor their children. I've already mentioned the need for imams and religious leaders to more easily grant Islamic-based divorce for women, especially those who are legally divorced but stuck in marital limbo given their husband's abusive power. In addition to single mothers and newcomers who speak other languages, queer Muslims and sectarian minorities, including Shia and Ismaili women, also report feeling excluded. And sometimes even hostility in mainstream Muslim spaces. For example, Shahina, who is straight and Sunni, and who generally feels like she is included within the Muslim community personally, she reports that she's actually witnessed anti-Black racism, among other forms of violence. She notes that the masjid is really the only place she's ever been able to access Muslim-specific resources, but also that, let's be honest, the masjid isn't really an open space. You want to make space for all kinds of Muslims, regardless of how they identify themselves, who they are, so they can feel comfortable in that space. Masjids need to do more to be inclusive of sexual, gender, and sectarian diversity if they are to meet the needs of the diverse Canadian Muslim populations. Additionally, they can provide support and resources or network with grassroots communities and organizations that center diverse Muslim populations. So for example, for Muslims with diverse abilities, there's SMILE, Canada Support Services. For Black Canadian Muslims, there's the Black Muslim Initiative. For sexually or gender diverse Muslims, there's the Unity Mosques. There's a network of Unity Mosques. There's Salam Canada, the Queer Muslim Resistance. To focus on gender-related issues, there's the Women's Mosque of Canada. And of course, there's the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. Turning to the theme of culturally relevant and appropriate services, I note that women asked for these services after experiencing exclusion and discrimination in mainstream servicing agencies or from service providers. So for example, Farishta is a newcomer who speaks Pashto, and she shared that no one has guided or assisted me in accessing care from specialists. I've been on a wait list for a specialist and operation for my health issues since 2019. This interview took place in 2021, so that's 2 years. And just recently been informed that the wait will be even longer. I wish the doctor could provide a pathway or some advice to access the care faster, since my health issues are very hard on me and very difficult. I have been constantly brushed off and told to wait, wait, and wait. I don't know how much longer I can wait. I've cried countless times to the staff begging for an appointment, and I was told that you probably also have depression since you're crying, and this isn't a crying matter. Farishta may be experiencing symptoms of depression, but note that these symptoms emerge from her trying to access a healthcare system that is chronically neglecting her needs. Based on the findings from this study, I argue that culturally sensitive services would not be necessary if health and social service providers could practice empathy and extend care for these women rather than dismissing them. To tackle health inequalities and disparities, medical communities and the social and health service providers need to critically assess the ways that systemic racism permeate the social service and healthcare systems. Practitioners especially need to be reflexively aware of when they dehumanize service recipients. Culturally specific services are a band-aid solution to underlying systems of injustice and are rarely adequate, effective, or sufficient. For example, one participant who speaks Pashto noted that she hardly receives Pashto translators. She's usually paired with Farsi or Urdu translators, and she tries to make do. This is not a solution. Healthcare and social service systems need to be inclusive of the diverse needs of an increasingly diverse Canadian population. Across the different groups of Canadian Muslim women that I spoke to, several women were community organizers and resource builders, and these were these rich stories of resilience. Across narratives, women shared about how they saw the need for services, or personally experiencing it themselves, and they responded by creating the services. This ranged from casual social support, so like small chosen families, for example, groups of friends, all the way to like funded community organizations. And so one way that we can support Canadian Muslim women is by creating support for these grassroots organizers. So for example, mentorship programs and other funding or resource sharing networks. I note that although the women expressed pride and a sense of accomplishment over the resources and communities that they built, they also shared very heartbreaking situations that they had to face that created the need for those resources in the first place, as well as the uphill battles that they fought to get those resources off the ground. For example, Batul notes how agencies put on a good face and post images of a Muslim woman in hijab or a Muslim man in a beard, but these superficial tactics fail to provide tangible utility in service provision. They're not useful for her. She shared that they'll put on a good face. All these offices will have a poster with a Muslim woman in hijab or a Muslim man in a beard, always Arab, because they don't know the greatest number of Muslims are in Indonesia. So they have a good face, but when it comes to actual support, services, resources, and I have tried multiple sectors to find the services that I was looking for, they said, we don't do advocacy. They do advocacy when they want to, for example, the Ukrainian immigrants or non-Muslim Indian immigrants, but not for Muslims. But they're the only settlement agency in the city, so who else would you go to? This is why I had to found my own organization, support services, to assist these women who are building their own resources, their own communities. It would be a service to many. As a final note to policymakers, community organizers, religious institutions, any decision-making body, I quote a participant who said, when you're making policies, if you don't have a variety of voices at the table, you're going to end up with policies that work better for one group than the other. For policies to be inclusive, those who are typically excluded due to systemic discrimination need to be included. Failure to do so leads to detrimental consequences for many. As Paria said, our community is never represented in programming or services. This affects us because when we are unable to communicate, we are unable to contribute to society, to speak up and to bring forth change that we want to see. We feel unheard and unseen. So thank you so much. That concludes my presentation. I now open the floor for any questions or comments or feedback that you will have for me.
Thank you, Sarah. That was pretty comprehensive. I know that there's so much rich information in the report itself. So I encourage everyone to read the report. It's got a lot of course, quantitative, data and analysis, and then the qualitative pieces. You just saw a fraction of what's in the report. So can we now? I'm going to first address the questions that were asked in the chat, and then we'll open it up to further questions. So thank you for your attention. We are going to be first addressing what we see in the chat. So we have a question from Alia. She's asking, is there any possibility of doing a comparison between Muslim women and other newcomer immigrants to assess if these issues can be shared between all new groups, not limited to Muslims only? So Sarah, I know that in the quantitative data, you have those comparisons, but could you address that question, please?
Mm-hmm. So in the quantitative data, the comparison is actually to non-Muslim Canadian women generally, not specifically to newcomers. Alia, thank you for that question. That I could do that. That would be a follow-up analysis. And I suspect that I would probably still see similar trends to what we've just assessed. If I can refer to work by Abdi Kazimapur from the University of Calgary, he doesn't do a gender-specific analysis, but he does do an analysis of newcomer Muslims to newcomers of other faith backgrounds. And what he finds is that longitudinally, so across time, newcomers of other faith backgrounds eventually integrate into the Canadian system. They experience like a positive incline in their outcomes. But when it comes to Muslims, their rate of growth it's so slow that it's almost like a flat slope. So when it comes to Muslim women, I suspect that I would find similar outcomes, but that is definitely an analysis worth doing, and I look forward to doing it.
Thank you, Sarah. So there's a question here from Miriam. She's saying, this is such interesting and valuable research. Thank you for sharing. I may have missed this, so apologies if this was mentioned. Were you able to speak with Francophone women? What was the geographic distribution of your research subjects? Thanks again.
Mhm. So I didn't speak to Quebecois, so women in Quebec. I didn't speak to Francophone women, unfortunately. We did try very hard to recruit participants who speak non-English languages. I had a number of research assistants who were recruiting not just French, but also Urdu, Arabic, Persian. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to recruit women who spoke non-English languages. Um, in terms of the geographic distribution, so the quantitative data is actually representative of Canadian Muslims, given the fact that it's drawn from the 2011 National Household Survey, which replaced the census. For the qualitative participants, I'm reluctant to reveal that level of detail about my participants, given the fact that they are a vulnerable population. And given the intersections that we're speaking about, it would be easy to identify them. So that I'm going to omit from public knowledge.
Can I just say something about our attempts at recruiting participants for the study? We did in fact even have the call out in French, and we didn't get Francophone participants in the qualitative research. So maybe one of the follow-ups, to the study is attempting different ways of reaching the populations that we could not reach. But we'll have to sort of go back and look at, what did we do that, or what could we do to improve our access to those populations, because we really do want to include them.
If I could also just make a follow-up, I can't say too much about the study because it hasn't been launched yet, but I am working with another organization to study the impact of certain legislation in Quebec. And so I will be speaking, not directly, but I will have a research associate speaking to women in Quebec to really understand those outcomes. So I'd be better able to respond to that question in a few years.
Absolutely. And just to share with you that in our Hate to Healing campaign, we have two videos actually from, that are in French. And there's one where there's a group of Francophone Muslim women who are talking about the impacts of Bill 21. So I would encourage you to view those videos if you're Francophone, or even if you're not, because they're very interesting, and you can find them on our daretobeaware.ca website. And look out for the videos in French. Thank you. I'm going to now read the next question. So the response of health service providers to Farishta is a clear indication of how the failure of the health system is normalized from within. Absolutely. Instead of problematizing this failure, how can they tell her that her crying over 2 years of waiting is not a crying matter? It's a statement more than a question, but can you comment on that, Sarah?
Yeah. So I will say that generally speaking, and this is a finding in this has been a consistent finding for decades, that healthcare providers routinely ignore concerns that are expressed by women, regardless of race, religion. Women, like as a category, are often dismissed by healthcare providers. And so, for example, health concerns related to women are often underfunded, understudied, under-researched, and male bodies or men's bodies are sort of understood as being the norm, and research around those issues are often the ones that get privileged. If you add intersectionality to the mix and you look at how race, religion, and other factors impact the experience of receiving healthcare. So for example, in the American context, although medical technology has advanced to what it is, still you have cases of African-American women dying giving birth because the doctors don't listen to them. And so on the one hand, it's appalling to see that this is an outcome. And on the other hand, it is routinized, it is normalized within the healthcare system. So this is something that really needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Thank you. So this is a comment and question from Yasmin, who says, this is so on point. Thanks for these accurate observations. Are there tools for subaltern in the Spivak way? Muslim women can help the Indigenous reality and be anti-racist in that regard within the Canadian French context. Interesting.
I love that question. So the Canadian French context is still quite broad. I would recommend actually, like, this should be a thing that all guests on Turtle Island do, to reach out to local Indigenous communities and to make connections, build bridges, have relationships. Like, our fight is all one fight. We're all fighting the same fight. We're not like helping each other, we're working together. So it's important to have these cross-community connections to expand the scope of our work, expand the consequences of our work as well.
Thank you, Sarah. So Khadija is thanking you, Sarah, for the presentation. And Muna is saying, thank you, Sarah, such important work. I can't wait to read the report. Just, I wonder if there is a specific reason why you chose to use the term diverse abilities rather than disabled or Muslim women with disabilities.
I'm happy to respond to that one as well. So generally speaking, it's dehumanizing to put the label before a person. So it's a woman with a disability rather than a disabled woman, right? And the reason that I say diverse abilities instead of disabilities is because I firmly believe that if our society was constructed in an inclusive way, that there would not be disabilities, there would just be diverse abilities. The disability comes from an assumption that human bodies should function in a very specific way, and then anything outside of that norm becomes a disability. So if I can give an example of stairs, we don't have to have stairs. We could have ramps. We could have really beautiful architecture that would allow for all individuals to be able to access different floors, right? But stairs is what we create because we assume that humans should be able to walk. So I prefer to use individuals with diverse abilities to just recognize the way that we construct assumptions about the way that the body should function, and that how those assumptions end up creating barriers for individuals who would not have to experience those barriers if they were included in the first place.
That's right. Thank you, Sarah. Al-Farouk is thanking you for the presentation. Jehan is commenting, excellent presentation, thank you. She has a question. Is there any variation depending on provinces, political party in office? So any observations there, Sarah?
That is an excellent question. I did not do a province by province comparison for this report. That is featured in my 2019 report, and I believe I split the sample, by gender, but not beyond that. So it's not an intersectional analysis, but that would be something that would be another analysis. The question on political party in office, that would be fascinating to actually see how that maps on at the province level as like an additional layer of analysis. I did not do that for this report though.
Thank you, that's great. So Isabelle Lauzon, who, by the way, is our program officer for gender and women and gender equality Canada. So welcome, Isabel. She's saying thank you for the presentation. You mentioned there could be internalized racism and languages involved between women, Muslim newcomers. Have I understood this correctly? Would you mind explaining a bit more or give an example?
So I can give an alternative example to make this a bit more clear. So for example, if a man is gay and he's closeted and he's trying to hide the fact, he might enact like a hyper form of masculinity, right, to compensate. And so individuals who have experienced racism, given their use of language, for example, I'll share that in the study, the women who speak Pashto mention the fact that they get stared at as if they're aliens, as if they don't belong. They get hostile, they have hostile interactions with others. I am so sorry about my birds. I don't know if you can hear them. So that experience of being alienated for using a language other than English or French, that might have an impact on when newcomers who are able to speak English see that kind of racist interaction. They might choose to only, like, they might police their own language and choose to speak English or French as a way to prevent that kind of experience from happening. Language policing, I note, is part of Canadian society historically as well. If you think about the way that Indigenous children in residential schools were forced to speak English, this is something that emerges from the American context as well. It's here in Canada still.
Yeah, I've actually experienced that as a child, where I
Yeah.
couldn't speak my mother tongue in my school, in elementary school, before I came to Canada, where I was, beaten for not speaking English in my class. So thank you, Sarah. And that's how racism becomes internalized. So Zahida has a question. She says, you list several recommendations. Where have we reached on that?
Well, nowhere, because the report was just published today. I have begun some organizing with CCMW to address some of the items that could be addressed within, like, Canadian Muslim communities. So, for example, trying to organize with imams that are a bit more sympathetic to the plight of women, or who just care about justice and equity, and they see the suffering of women who are denied divorce, for example. So there's been some grassroots activism around there, but I'm looking forward to this report getting picked up and the consequences of these policies having positive impacts for not just the women that need to be included, but also for Canadians more generally, who will also benefit from a more inclusive approach to policies, practices, and procedures.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So yes, I mean, we will be looking at those recommendations more closely, and hopefully making further recommendations to policymakers and service providers as well. So the next, you've got lots of people thanking you for your super informative report. Here's another question. Assalamu alaikum. Are you able to elaborate on sample size for the qualitative work? Were focus groups divided by the categories you outlined in the presentation, for instance, diversely abled, single moms, etc.? Or how was that conducted? I understand your reluctance to elaborate on the qualitative geographic distributions. How generalizable are they? Actually, I had a similar question for you, Sarah, but go ahead, please.
So I would recommend using the qualitative and quantitative analyses as they are meant to be used. You'd never want to use qualitative analyses for the sake of making generalizations, never. That is more the realm of quantitative analyses, where you're drawing on samples that are representative of the general population. The qualitative analyses are useful for shedding light on the connections between variables that you see in the quantitative analysis. So they explain what you're seeing at the quantitative level. In terms of the categories of the focus groups, I asked women how they identified. I told the women the different categories of focus groups that I was holding, and I asked them how they identified, and they selected into the focus group that they chose. So, for example, I had a participant who I mentioned who was Black and a newcomer. She chose to participate in the focus group for Black women, not newcomers. And not surprisingly, the focus group of newcomers was all South Asian or brown, so Turkish, Persian. There were no Black women in the focus group of newcomers.
Interesting.
Yeah, the same thing with if an individual identified as being diversely abled, I allow them to participate in that focus group. But I will mention that the interviews with individuals who are diversely abled, given the difficulty in trying to secure interviews with them, I actually just ended up interviewing them individually instead of as a focus group, because it was not possible.
Yeah, and I think that's another limitation that that we had. It was so difficult to reach the women that we really wanted to reach, even when we made the efforts, to do outreach in different ways. But nevertheless, we've learned a lot from maybe what to do next time. But these voices are are so important, so necessary for us to listen to, in terms of what you've already gathered, Sarah.
Mhm.
So hello, Glenda, nice to see you here.
If I could just add
Um,
a thing to what you just mentioned about the methods,
mhm,
about inclusion of women at the margins, I think part of it is also trust building. So as the women see that this organization, for example, is doing the work, is including the voices of those who are usually excluded, they might have a bit more hope and faith and know that, this won't be pointless. There will actually be a consequence for participating.
absolutely. And and the consequence hopefully will lead to positive change.
Exactly.
Thanks, Sarah. So Glenda, thank you for your questions. So she has two questions. Number one, is there a difference you noted between the larger urban centers and smaller centers? And did you find reaching respondents in smaller centers difficult? Will you address recommendations for smaller centers as well as larger centers? And then question two, did you get feedback, observations from professionals who deal with this population-based anecdotal comments? If not, would you consider adding this to your research? I think that professionals can provide more insight, especially for clients who are not likely to respond, not likely to understand what the systemic problems that they encountered were. So,
Mhm.
so good, very good questions. Go ahead,
For
Sarah.
sure. For the first question, so I did not experience more difficulty in recruiting from smaller centers than larger centers, but in terms of the difference between the two spaces, I would say that those who are in more remote areas, they have to fight so much harder to find the kinds of resources that they need. Those who are in larger, so by larger center, I'm assuming that you mean urban area versus like more remote area. If that's not what you mean, I'm so sorry, please do clarify that. But those who are in more urban areas, there's higher Muslim populations as well. Referring back to the 2019 report, in the appendix C, I have maps of the concentration of the density concentration of Canadian Muslims across Canada. And you can see that in urban areas, there are a lot more Muslims. And so Muslims, when they organize internally and they create their own resources, it ends up providing some benefits for Muslim women at the margins as well. But those who are in remote areas, they have, it's a real uphill battle for them. For the second question about professionals, that was not an intentional thing that happened, but I mentioned one of the participants is a sociologist as well, and she is someone who is a professional in the field who works with other newcomer and refugee women who are Muslim and non-Muslim. And so I was able to gain insight from her. I did not go out seeking professionals for the sake of inclusion in the study, but rather to get an insight of like what's going on. So I spoke to a number of people in my network who are familiar with the populations. I did not include that though, because it wasn't systematic, like it wasn't part of the study itself. It was more to just for my own gaining awareness and background in the populations. I really wanted to hear from the women themselves. I'm not so much interested in hearing what professionals have to say about them, because as we saw in the data, the professionals don't really have, don't necessarily have the same kind of awareness about the lives of these women as they have about themselves. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have a comment. So by the way, the report is available on our website at ccmw.com. That's www.ccmw.com. So you can download it from there. We also have some infographics that summarize some of the findings. So we encourage you to consult those and share those as well. One recommendation from Fawzia, she's saying, Salam, recent news has focused on how women are advancing in positions of leadership in the healthcare system. A study such as this should be shared with those organizations of women healthcare leaders and healthcare providers. And then she was wondering how we're going to be sharing the report. So in terms of sharing the report, so we're putting a release out right after the launch on our listserv. We're going to be disseminating the highlights of the report through our social media. We are also hoping to hold a panel, and we hope to invite some of the the women themselves who participated, and then maybe some service providers as well who could be discussants or responders to the findings. So that you'll see over the next several weeks leading up to International Women's Day, we're going to be sharing more and more of the findings in different ways. But you can go and consult the report online, download it, and read it at your leisure from our website. So you know what? I'm just doing a time check. We have about 10 minutes left. I have so many more questions from people. So if you don't mind, Sarah, can we extend the session for maybe another 15 minutes, and we'll end promptly at 2:45. Is that okay with everyone? If there's vehement opposition, we can stop. But there's so many more questions, and I appreciate the engagement. So great, thank you. If anyone wants to leave, please go ahead at 2:30, but this is so interesting. I certainly will be here. So Aisha is asking, how did you define the category of newcomer in terms of the length of lived experience in Canada?
So conventional practice is to define that as folks who have been in Canada for 5 years or less.
Great. So, all right. Amazing. So let's see. Isabel, do you have another question? Oh, you have to go. So thank you for joining us. And also there will be a recording available. So please do check out the recording if you miss any part of this presentation. Thank you, Miriam, as well. Okay. I know that there are more people that had questions. Did I miss anybody? Feel free actually to use your mic to ask questions if we've missed any. Anyone else? So there's a question from Jihan. Would age of arrival and educational level affect their difficulties?
Yes, definitely. So age of arrival impacts the educational trajectory itself. So folks who come to Canada after completing education often end up finding that they need to go back to school to earn further Canadian-based credentials, because their foreign education is often not recognized or respected by Canadian employers. And so that can be very demotivating to realize that you've put years of effort into your training only to have it not count. So those who are young and are able to slide into education, whether at any points up till high school, it doesn't have that much of an impact. But when it's university or beyond, that's when it has more of an impact. In terms of educational levels, those who have more education have more options, more opportunities. And so they have a bit more access, while they do still experience an anti-Muslim labor markets. So they experience Islamophobia like on the labor market, they still have better chances of being employed compared to those who have less advanced degrees, for example.
That's right. Thank you. Sarah, are there any other questions, comments? Feel free to use your mic to speak now, because I think we've exhausted all the ones in the chat. So I really appreciate that, Sarah. You did an amazing job. I was thinking that we were going to go beyond the 2:30 end time. I'm sorry, there's some kind of a protest going on outside, and I'm totally distracted from the shouts out there. Who knows what they're protesting?
I really appreciate the questions that are sort of positioning future research as well. Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and feedback as well. I'm excited for like the second version of this report now.
Yes, and also one of the things that we have, inshallah, coming the census data that will be released from the 2021 census, which will have the the religion question included, we will have further analysis of that data for Canadian Muslim women, hopefully. And we're working with the Muslims in Canada Data Project as well, so that we will have more survey data, but we will also have the census data, which hopefully we'll be able to share with you in the future. Jehan, you have your hand up. If you want to lower, or if you want to unmute yourself, please. Can someone unmute Jehan? I think she has her hand up.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
was just following up. In terms of coping with the difficulties, how did their age and educational level help or get in the way?
I would say that the younger participants had a not easier time, but they were more able to find ways to cope. They had more awareness generally about their mental health and mental health states. And I think this is a trend more broadly speaking about like the Canadian or American population. The youth today are more self-aware when it comes to concerns around mental health and mental wellness compared to previous generations. Was the second item education? Is that what you mentioned? I think it was education.
Actually, it was, it was the age and education level, but in relation to their age of arrival in Canada. But I could add their experiences, their previous experiences. I would think, but correct me, that coming with experience sometimes makes one more flexible.
By experience, do you mean like life experience or?
Yes, gaining skills, having, been in the world and transitioning. There's also the difference between a refugee and an immigrant.
For sure. I would argue that in order for life experience to be useful in terms of mental health, you need to have cognitive flexibility as well. And now we're getting into the realm of psychology instead of sociology. So I'm gonna come back to like categorical analyses of the different groups of women. So I will say that those who are younger and those who are better educated, those who came from a context of privilege. So if they, for example, had a house and property and sold those things before moving to Canada, and they came here with those kinds of resources versus, being a refugee and having escaped war, all those factors definitely play a role in an individual's ability to cope with lived experiences in the Canadian context.
Certainly.
If I can draw on one example, actually, I believe it is mentioned in the report. There is a participant who identifies as queer. She is a refugee, and she experienced a lot of violence in the Middle East before coming. And so although she's young and although she's well educated, she was pursuing graduate studies when the incident happened. This incident still happened in her university classroom. Her professor showed images that were very violent of incidents in the Middle East, which triggered this participant. And so while she is young, while she is very educated, the context that she came from still that played a significant role in her ability to cope in terms of mental health.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I read that in the report, I remember. So Yasmin, I'll come back to you in a minute. We have a question from Zahida who's saying, what can we do at the grassroots level? How can these people be reached to get assistance, say, for instance, with English language, I guess?
Yeah, I would recommend, so these people is a very broad term. Figure out which individuals you want to access specifically and recruit them actively. Go to the organizations where they would usually seek support and partner with those organizations, build bridges, grow community. This happens through individual level relationships that grow into organizations, grow into communities. It doesn't happen without that individual level effort. And you need to demonstrate that you're firmly committed to their well-being and to their interests by listening to them rather than telling them what you want from them or of them for them.
Thanks, Sarah. I think Yasmin, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you for this beautiful presentation and organization. I'm still having a little bit of unease with one thing. I'm probably sure this is not the point of this report, but maybe you can help me orienting towards the response I'm looking for. So basically, from what I heard, obviously I haven't read the report yet. It's 99 pages. I see that it's very accurate from what I know and what I've seen around me. And this is a really good portraiture, but I still have troubles seeing what are the avenues, what are the tools offered to these women and to these vulnerable populations. I understand that there's a need of accessing and everything, but I personally find that while navigating particularly challenging socioeconomical circumstances, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible to navigate that in a manner that is anti-racist? Because by doing the anti-racist work early on, and I know it's not always easy to be aware of that, but if there's tools available, that way it's you're not helping mend this broken system of racism. So what are the resources, what are the ways that are available for people, Muslim women, to be able to navigate better this system? Thank you.
That's a great question. That you're actually talking about the next step that comes after this report. So the purpose of this report was to investigate the needs, experiences, the barriers, and the facilitators to certain outcomes, and to gain awareness around that. The next step is what you're talking about of what to do with this information now.
Mm-hmm. I think I can respond very briefly, but we have so much more work to do in responding to the needs identified here. So I don't know if you know, but the Canadian Council of Muslim Women coordinates legal services for Canadian Muslim women. And we did this precisely because there was a need for the women to access services that were, that were being delivered by those who are, sensitive to their needs. And also those who are familiar with the language because they happen to be part of the faith communities. So I think it's really important for us to do that. We're doing something very similar for women facing gender-based violence now. You'll be hearing more about that from us. I should point out to you that many of the women that contact us for these services, it truly are marginalized. They often don't have a place to live. They often don't have money to feed themselves or their kids. They're escaping violent family situations. And many of them actually don't speak English and they ask us, if they can speak to someone who speaks their language. Not always easy, but so far so good. But as we're doing providing this coordination program, we are identifying more and more gaps. And certainly when we are doing similar work for women experiencing gender-based violence, there's going to be more that we can do. So this is just a tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to be done. And to one of the recommendations that Sarah made about support groups, we actually did start, something like that earlier. And we also have friendly moms who have engaged with us to help us, where the woman insists that she must have an Islamic divorce because the family is demanding it, even though she has a legal divorce. So it keeps on coming up over and over again. But we have found some women-friendly imams who've been helping us in that regard. I know that we're at 2:35 or 2:34. So one last question from Aisha, and then I'm going to ask Nina to close up the session. So Aisha's asking, sorry if I missed it, but did you have a chance to interview multiple generations of women from the same families to see differences in intergenerational experiences? There were some hints in the quotes you shared, like one participant referring to her mother, telling her, read more Quran as an advice to overcome her struggles. But I would like to hear more if you have more to share on this.
Mhm. So there was one set of a mother-daughter set of participants in the sample, but that was the only one. I would be reluctant to make generalizations based on just that one because of the fact that it's qualitative data rather than quantitative data. This is an interesting question, though, of intergenerational experiences in the ways that parents' experiences shape children's experiences and vice versa. This would be a separate study entirely, actually, of studying household or family level processes. It's fascinating. I would love to explore that.
So on that, I think people should watch your presentation during our Muslim Women Scholar Series, because it sort of touched on the family dynamics, particularly, married couples, but also broader families. And then we had another presentation, excellent presentation by Arish Ilmi about the narratives, familial narratives, where the participants were writing letters from their parents' perspective about their experiences. I think that was an amazing presentation by Arish. So if you would like, you can access both those presentations from our website. But yes, another topic for further research, Sarah. Thank you so much. And our team has shared the link to our Muslim Women Scholar Series. And there's a lot of good information, by the way, a lot of great presentations, and there'll be more coming this year. So on that note, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you all for participating. It was really engaging and enlightening. And please do read the report and all of the other materials related to it that are now available on our website. Over to you, Nina.
I would also just like to thank the audience members so much. Thank you so much for excellent questions. I'm looking forward to incorporating these into my research as well to answer these questions that you've posed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear Sarah. Thank you so much for your efforts in shining a light on the experience of newcomer Muslim women, on Black Muslim women, queer Muslim women, and Muslim women with diverse abilities in Canada. Indeed, all of their voices do matter. Sarah, we pray that God bless you and reward you with many more years of scholarship and leadership. You don't just talk the talk, you actually walk the walk. And I hope that studies like yours remind us to remember the suffering of our fellow humans, Muslim and non-Muslim, around the world and in our own backyards. Let us find ways to include them, listen to them, and acknowledge their experiences. Let us always find ways to help them with our prayers, words, and actions. In Surah 4, verse 124 of the Holy Quran, it states, "If any do deeds of righteousness, be they male or female, and have faith, they will enter heaven, and not the least of injustice will be done to them." Please, God, allow us to be better allies to our siblings in humanity. Please fill our hearts with love, compassion, and empathy. And finally, many thanks to our team at CCMW. Nushat, Zainab, and Iman have been very supportive and helped bring this seminar together. And we want to thank the Government of Canada and the Department of Women and Gender Equality for the funding to bring this research to fruition. Thanks to all of you who's tuned in today. Your support and friendship are much appreciated. And we're so happy to see old friends and meet new friends here today. And remember to keep in touch with CCMW, follow our website, ccmw.com, and social media posts for upcoming events and projects. Until then, take care and assalamu alaikum.